Okay, folks, we're going to get started with the analysis portion of part 7 of Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. And, in the last part, we were talking about how industrialism, liberalism, capitalism, and that kind of stuff. So here he's going to extend this a little bit and give you examples and tie it in with the previous parts of the chapter. And he said, we have already given some attention to the fashion in which a number of Western European innovations, such as industrialism and the demographic explosion, diffused outward to the peripheral non-European world at such different rates of speed that they arrived in Asia in quite a different order from that in which they had left Western Europe. The same phenomenon can be seen within Western civilization in regard to the 19th century characteristics of Europe, which we have enumerated. Okay, he gives you examples of nationalism and the rates of speed that it formed inside Europe and their results. And then he gives you an example of how it diffused out to Russia and then out to the rest of the world, and its effects. And then he's gonna go into a special case of even though they're within Western Europe, Germany and Italy didn't follow the pattern of everything that happened within England. Okay, he gives you an example of how socialism and universal free education appeared in Central Europe before it appeared in England. And socialism is a product of Central Europe, whereas liberalism and democracy is more of a pattern of, say, the Western Europe rather than Central Europe. Okay, here he's going to give an example of how the different pieces, if they don't arrive in the same order, it can complicate things or give a different result. Okay, he says, as an example of such complication, we might mention that Western Europe, nationalism, industrialism, and liberalism and democracy were reached in that order. But in Germany, they all appeared about the same time. And to the Germans, it appeared that they could achieve nationalism and industrialism, both of which they wanted, more rapidly and more successfully if they sacrificed liberalism and democracy. Thus, Germany's nationalism was achieved in an undemocratic way by blood and iron, as Bismarck put it, while the industrialism was achieved under state auspices rather than through liberalism. And when you have industrialism and nationalism married together without liberalism and democracy, you get what we call fascism. So fascism was not invented, as we believed, or as they would have you believe, under Adolf Hitler in the Third Reich. It was actually in the Second Reich under Bismarck. It was actually Otto Bismarck that, with the blood and iron, and without having nationalism and industry without democracy and liberalism. You can still see that today because most of your banks are still more state-run or state-controlled or industry-controlled in Germany. You know, the German financing in strict guidelines is still in order. You can see that how it plays out under Merkel, in the EU, because the way Germans and the Swiss like to bank is much different than the way, say, England and France and even Italy like to bank. Even the way they handle crises, how the different ways that they wanted to handle the Greek crisis is different. So you can still see how these things still play out, even under even today, even though it was developed 100 years ago. And said, accordingly, while Western Europe, with plenty of capital and cheap democratic weapons, could finance its industrialization with liberalism and democracy in Central Europe had difficulty financing industrialism. And said this meant that the capital for railroads and factories had to be raised with government assistance. Liberalism waned. Rising nationalism encouraged this tendency, and the undemocratic nature of existing weapons made it clear that both liberalism and democracy were living in the most precarious existence. In other words, it was, after World War I, when Germany was defeated, they tried their hand at democracy. They tried their hand at liberalism, but it failed. And then they reverted back to what they knew. They reverted back to fascism. They reverted back to blood and iron. They reverted back to warfare under Adolf Hitler. So in Quigley's mind, nationalism and industrialism, or industry, is a more sturdy trait than some of the other esoteric things. And he says the less sturdy traits are more fragile. Here in his quote, he said, among these less sturdy traits of Western Europe's great century, you might mention liberalism, democracy, the parliamentary system, optimism, and the belief in the inevitable progress. These were, we might say, flowers of such a delicate nature that they could not survive any extended period of stormy weather. And he said in the 20th century subjected them to long periods of stormy weather. So, this is a quote that you might use someplace else. So we're gonna look at this later on in the chapter, later on in this book, and these things will come back. He's going to go more into depth when he looks at each of these particular societies individually.